You want to get started with game development. I'm sorry to hear that. I'm just kidding, of course, it's not that bad, but I do want to talk a bit more about what are some things you need to know going into this, and like, do you really want to do this? Because don't get me wrong, game dev can be fun at times, but my god, it can also be depressing at times where, you know, you feel like you're not making any progress. And I think there are some things that you should keep in mind before you condemn yourself to this hellish landscape. Okay, I'm really going too dramatic. I promise it's not that bad. But I get the question often of, hey Marnix, I'm getting started with game development. What do you suggest to me? Like, what should I do and all of that? Do you have any advice for me that's like more high level, not just, oh, make horror games or whatever? What can you tell me? And I think the first thing that I really want you to understand when getting started with game development is understanding, why am I doing this? Are you getting into game development because you grew up playing video games your whole life and now you kind of just want to pick it as a hobby because you saw that, hey, Godot has been doing some cool stuff, or Unreal or whatever, and you found some Unity tutorials and whatever, and you're like, okay, I want to make my own games now because it's going to be fun? Or do you want to get into game dev because you saw videos from blokes like me and some other YouTubers where they showcase how they've been making a lot of money sometimes from game development, and you're like, hey, actually, I'm already a programmer, maybe I can just make games instead of making boring business applications. Wouldn't that be the move? I think being honest with this is going to be really important, because I will not judge you if you're like, hey, yeah, I'm kind of just in here for the money. But I think you do need to be honest and not pretend, if that's the case, that you're doing this for your own passion and all of it, because those things don't always match really well. Like the thought of, okay, I'm going to focus on just doing games as a hobby and I'm gonna have more of a relaxed casual style, versus, okay, I'm going into this and I'm going to, my first game is going to be like Stardew Valley, and then I'm gonna retire my family and I'm going to live in Bali and sip cocktails all day. Both are valid approaches, and there's a lot of other approaches in between those as well. Like it's not just that you can only make games as a hobby or as a soulless grifter, like pushing out slop to the masses every month. There's a lot of points in between. Maybe you want to try the publisher route, maybe you want to do so much, but I think you should be honest to begin with yourself. What are you actually planning on doing, and keep that in mind throughout your entire development cycle. If you are like, hey, I want to do this for a hobby, then yeah, it doesn't really matter as much that you want to make an RPG game, for example. But if you're like, hey, yeah, I'm going into this purely for the money, then you probably don't want to make just puzzle games and whatever, because those are just genres that don't really work. You need to be more analytical, and you need to really look at, okay, what are the things that are going to work for my approach to game dev, yes and no. So just be honest with yourself, I think, is the first thing. What are your expectations going into game development? Because you want to be able to look back in a year from now when you're getting started and be like, okay, yeah, actually, I think I did hit those expectations. This is what I expected it was going to be, whether that be for fun or for money or for anything else really. And then we get, this is something, you know, we've talked about enough, other game dev YouTubers have talked about enough, so I'll go over it quickly. Don't start with your dream game, please. You don't have the skills to make your dream game, most likely. You don't have like the dope sheet of failures, of things you've learned yourself the hard way with game development. You probably won't be able to make your dream game. Or if you can make your dream game, it's not going to be what you actually envisioned. Or if you really are able to make your dream game and it's the first game that you've ever developed, I think you need to dream bigger, my dudes. Like, dream games generally are things that you look at 10 years down the line. Going into this and being like, okay, I'm going to make my dream game immediately is kind of like being a couch potato, and it's like, oh, my New Year's resolution is that I'm going to become a professional pole vaulter. And it's like, wait, hold on, you're nowhere, you can barely even run 5K. Where are you going to get the stamina and the like strength and explosion and things like that to actually become a professional pole vaulter, for example? I know this is a weird analogy, but it's kind of the same. Like, you need to do so many steps in between that you genuinely shouldn't try for your dream game right now. Like, you can, there's a whole lot of schools of thought and things like that, but you can think, okay, I want to make my dream game is going to be an RPG in this setting with these mechanics. Can you take like a single mechanic and just make a game about that already, for example, and build your way up that way? It's going to be much more important. Your dream game is generally not something that you can do solo either, because you're going to want artists, you're going to want programmers, you're going to have a big scope and all of that. All of these things right now shouldn't be something that you worry about. I think this also leads into another piece of advice that I have for you, and that is what you often hear with those dream games when people come to me and it's like, yeah, I have this 50-page game design document of my game and it has so much story and I have like all these characters and things like that, and I'm going to make it, and how do you think my game design document is? I'm gonna spend 2 years development on it. I'm gonna have a first demo available in 4 months or something. My thing here is, don't overplan. just iterate. I've talked a bunch about like working on smaller games on this channel. That's kind of the design philosophy that I have in general. But keep in mind, the reason for that is that at the end of the day, we want to sustain the studio. This is why you have to be honest with yourself. Like, what is the goal? If your goal is just like, you know, do it for fun as a hobby, you don't need to follow the small games meta. You can spend more time, do more casual development on whatever game you want to make, for example. In our case, we want to make smaller games because that means that we have a quicker turnaround time, we can learn faster. What this also means is that we can just iterate faster on game design, game mechanics and whatever. I've met people who have literally spent 2 to 3 months just writing out how they think that their game is going to feel, like how their mechanics are going to be and things like that. And they have never even opened an engine. And it's just weird to me that you can be certain that your game is going to be a massive hit and the game design is really good and the game loop is really fine if you've never even prototyped it. And to a certain degree, like you have different schools of thought, of course, that are like, yeah, game design documents, you need to have something. I think you always need to have some point to write down your ideas, but I don't think it needs to be like 50 pages long where you do in-depth breakdowns of every mechanic, every ability and things like that, because genuinely, you don't know what's good yet. And that's fine, but you, instead of thinking and planning and being like, oh, let me ask ChatGPT what they think is a good game mechanic, because ChatGPT knows everything, right? You could also just ask ChatGPT to write a prototype for you almost in Unity in like the same time, and you would actually have tangible proof of, hey, this game idea, it's good, it's bad, it's completely useless, and work based on that. At the end of the day, if you're a game developer, most of your work should be done in engine. It shouldn't be done in Word or in Notion or whatever, because you can't sell a Notion page on Steam at the end of the day. I think this leads to a bigger point as well, where it's not just planning. You can like research as much as you want, but you're going to have to do the work at some point, especially when, you know, when you get started with game development, that first month, it's like, yes, this is awesome. And I watched like a whole bunch of tutorials and things like that. And you start with making your prototypes, with making your game and things like that. And then you're okay. I feel like my game design is not ideal. Like the thing you had in your original game design document, you put in a prototype, but you're not fully sold on it. I'm going to do research, meaning I'm going to play similar games, or I'm going to watch videos of like game design studies, GMTK, RaceFic, whatever, about what makes these games so great. And the problem is at a certain point, like your research is kind of useless. It's like kind of tutorial hell, but in this case, it's not researching how do I make something, it's researching good game design. This goes back to, you know, iteration. You can say that, oh yeah, I played 10 hours of Domekeeper or whatever for research, whereas most of the research you can do will actually be from either reading Steam comments of your competing games and playing like a first half hour, hour plus of a game, not more, because by that first hour, normally the core game mechanics should all be explained and everything like that. And I know this sucks to hear. It's like, oh yeah, but I want to play my games, because you probably got into game development because you like playing games to begin with. But playing games is not going to give you a great game. Once again, it's making the game, it's spending time in the engine, and it's a very quick escape. It can be like, oh, I don't want to develop on my game, whatever. And it's like, oh, I'm just going to do some research. And then suddenly 4 hours have passed because supposedly Stellaris is research. You shouldn't be making 4X games, by the way. Keep that in mind as well. I think you just need to have some discipline as well to actually doing game dev. There's going to be a lot of parts of game dev that aren't going to be as fun, as engaging. You're going to realize that, hey, writing code kind of sucks, or making this game look good actually isn't as easy as just applying a LUT and a shader and I'm good to go. And at those points, you don't need to get yourself distracted, because you'll probably also get like shiny object syndrome, because you'll play one of your games for research and you're like, but what if I completely change my game and I focus on making this mechanic instead? Just stick to what you're doing and try to see it to completion as well. Seeing things to completion is going to be one of your biggest struggles, most likely, as a game developer as well. And then as part of this iteration thing, I guess as well, is the fact that, okay, you do not want to do everything yourself. You can do prototyping, like I said, like, oh, you should do prototyping. Don't do it, for the love of God, with gray boxes and like, you know, just the default Unity bean. I know it's like funny for like devlogs and whatever, but really, you're not selling Unity beans on the Steam marketplace. You probably want to use some sort of asset. And I think that is a big thing. Most of our audience, your solo developers, lean into making something that has decent visuals from day one, basically, and also has some of the gameplay mechanics already, versus just focusing on like, oh, I make these cubes move around and I have no final vision of what the game is going to be like. I've seen like people who are like, okay, I'm gonna be making a magical city builder or whatever. And then their first prototypes is literally just placing down gray cubes on like a default ground plane. And it's like, yeah, none of your magic is really being shown here. All I'm doing is placing down buildings. There are so many asset packs. At the end of the day, it's not really that hard to throw in some animations or whatever, or some basic feel, and making your game feel good at the same time to realize that, okay, this game is going to have potential. Use assets as much as you can. Like, I know it can be like, oh, I want to make everything myself. I want to do the code, and I want to learn 3D modeling, and I want to learn audio, and I want to learn 2D art, and you want to learn so many more things, game design, whatever. It's going to take way longer than you think, and you're probably going to be spending way too long on your game, and you'll give up somewhere along the way and you won't see it to completion. So really spend some money on getting some assets, some visuals. You even have free assets and things like that if you really want to. It's going to be worth it. Trust me, if you want to share your game with anyone and not be ashamed of how the game looks. Because if you're going to show your 2 cubes to someone else, no matter how good the game feel is, it's still gonna be like, I don't know how this feels, honestly. It's still going to be too hard for them to envision it as an actual game and a setting and all of that. So immediately from day one, try and stick a bit to that as well. And then this final piece of advice that I have, especially for people who are beginning, and it's kind of also something that you often hear on Reddit of like, oh, why are there no game dev YouTubers that have good advice, that are like, oh, sharing how you should actually make games. It's all like, oh, failure and I lost this much money and whatever. I think you need to realize that instead of trying to go for perfect, let's try for just not making the most miserable mistakes possible, because this is something I see a lot of people fall into, where they're like, I'm gonna make perfect game design because I only watch like game design YouTubers or whatever, and I don't want to watch the failures and whatever, and then they end up making the exact same mistakes that we did because they felt too good to look at what the mistakes other people were making. Instead of trying to go for perfect for your first game, let's try just not doing the overly obvious failures and like not launching with a launch discount, launching in the middle of a Steam sale, not doing any marketing, not getting any playtesting, not like, there's so many things that you can probably avoid by looking at all of those failure devlogs and things like that. I think you need to be humble enough to understand that you're not going to be the next Stardew Valley. You're not going to be a perfect game designer on your first game. Most of the games that you think are like, oh, first releases are from developers who have released tens of games before. And I think you kind of just need to ego check yourself and realize that, hey, I'm not gonna be the next Mozart. I'm not going to be the next Olympic pole vaulter, if you want to go back to earlier. But instead, I'm going to have to take these things step by step. And let's just try not to fall over to begin with. Let's not worry even about hitting the pole in like optimal arch form for our pole vaulting metaphor. Let's just make sure I can even reach from the start to the actual like pole vault area. Let's start with that. Let's make sure I don't trip over my shoelaces. And then once you're able to comfortably reach that point, then you can start looking at the more advanced topics. That's a bit of my advice. I hope these things make sense. If you're new here, we're game developers, like you may have guessed, and we make our own games. We make a bunch of mistakes along the way. We do some good things as well. Don't worry about that. And we talk about all of it in depth on this YouTube channel. If that is something that you're interested in, you want to know more about it, go ahead down below and subscribe. We upload these videos 2 times a week, and I get happy when you click that subscribe button as well. So thank you very much for watching. I hope this was interesting. And if you are someone who maybe has a bit more experience, what is a piece of advice that you would give to a beginning game developer? Put it in the comments down below as well. I'm very interested to read about that. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!